We all have times in our life when we're dealing with a difficult situation. Often that's a difficult person, and we're not quite sure how to do it. We get wrapped up in feeling stressed, feeling confused, not knowing whether to stay, whether to go. For example, if it's a relationship that we're dealing with, it can be really overwhelming. One of the things that I find really helpful in understanding and better managing those stressful situations, those stressful people in our life, again, we all have them, um, is to look at where we have control and where we don't have control. So I'm going to be talking to you about that a little bit today, and I appreciate your being with me. This is Ann Goshen. I'm with the Couples Toolbox. I'm a couples therapist in San Diego, California, and I'm really pleased to be able to provide a little bit of information that hopefully will help you in dealing with those challenging situations, challenging people in your life. So what I like to start with is to think about three concentric circles. If you think about three concentric circles, and the middle part of that circle, the center circle, that's the area where you have some control. That's the area where you have power in dealing with this situation or with a person. It's important to distinguish that from the outer circle. And the outer circle is where you don't have control. Something that's out of your control, you have no influence over that person, for example. You have no power there. What I find is really, really difficult and frustrating and overwhelming for many of the people that I work with is that they put a lot of their time, energy, and focus into that outer circle, the circle where they do not have any power and any control. And what happens is when we put our energy and focus into an area where we have no control, and usually when we're dealing with another person, it's their behavior. It's what they think, what they do. We have no control over that. I often hear people in my office say things like, well, they shouldn't do that, should they? They shouldn't be doing that. That's not right. That may be true, and we could sit and talk all day about the fact that that may not be right. However, it is what it is. So I think the first step in dealing with that outer circle, the part of the situation that we have no control over, again, when dealing with another person, it's usually that other person we have no control over, is to really recognize it is what it is. As soon as I begin to take that attitude, it is what it is, this is the way they are, I can't change them, I can't control them, I need to focus on where I do have some control and where I do have some influence. So the center circle, again, this is the area where I do have some control. And basically it's my behavior, what I choose to do or not do, how I choose to respond to that person and react to them. Also what I choose to think, because actually we don't often realize this, but I have some power to change my thinking. So one of the phrases I like to use a lot when I'm dealing with something stressful, the first one, as I mentioned, it is what it is, and that's accepting the reality. This is the way it is, that's the way that person is. The second one is if I find myself getting preoccupied with those kinds of thoughts, like upsetting that it's the way it is, upsetting that they're not doing what I want them to do, is to say something to myself like, this is not helpful for me to think about right now. I'm going to put that away. I'm going to put that thought away because it's not helpful. I also find that it can be really useful to, as I'm saying, this is not a helpful thought for me to have right now, I'm going to just put that away, put that on the back burner, is to actually visualize that. An image that I have used a lot is imagining a shelf high up on a wall. And I'll say to myself when I'm realizing that I'm getting preoccupied with focusing on a stressful situation and that I have no control over, is I'll say, this is not helpful, this is not useful for me to think about right now. I'm going to put that on the shelf, and I actually visualize in my mind putting that thought up on the shelf. There's something about making the statement to myself, creating that image, and actually mentally seeing myself doing the act, putting it on the shelf. Some people like to put something in a drawer, put it in the trunk of their car, throw it in the fireplace, bury it in a hole in the wall. The image can be very, very powerful in helping to let go of stressful thoughts that we have no control over. I talked about that outside circle, the stress, the part that we have no control over. Talked about the inside circle as well. That's where I do have control. Again, my own behavior. I can begin to get some control over my own thoughts. And as I do that, as I change my behavior and I look at letting go of thoughts that are not helpful, then actually my feelings will change and I can have a little bit more calmness in my life and free my energy up for something that's more important. What about that middle ring? The middle circle is the area of influence. So this is when we're dealing with another person. This is where I may have some influence. Now, one of the things I find often happens is that we think we have influence over somebody and we actually don't. I had a client recently in my office and she was complaining about her adult son. He was in his late 20s. He was making some choices and doing some things in his life that were very, very upsetting to her. And she spent quite a bit of time and energy worrying about him, worrying about what he was doing, and also telling him what he was doing and telling him the consequences of what he was doing. Unfortunately, what happened was he wasn't going to listen to her. He wasn't in that frame of mind yet. And so she was attempting to influence him. He was pushing back, and what was happening is actually pushing him away as she tried to tell him what to do and tell him the mistakes he was making, and she would get more and more agitated with him. He started pulling away and withdrawing from her. So actually what happened, it was that in trying to control him and trying to exercise influence over him when he wasn't open to that, is that he was actually being pushed further away and withdrawing further from her, which meant she actually had less influence over him. So recognizing that and recognizing where she could influence him. So for example, she could influence him by, when she was with him, making sure it was a nice time, keeping things kind of light at that point, inviting him to dinner, but for at least until he was more open to her influence, to be able to hold back on the suggestions and the criticisms, because it wasn't working, it was pushing him away, and it was making her feel even more powerless. So where do you start with this? I think we talked about it. First, acknowledge your feelings. Acknowledge, I'm frustrated, I'm overwhelmed. This person isn't doing what I want them to do. They're not responding to me. Acknowledge your feelings without judging them, without making yourself feel bad about them or guilty about them. The second one is work on calming your emotions. Because when we're dealing with a stressful person or situation in our life, the more our emotions are agitated, the harder it's going to be. And the more it's going to affect other parts of our life. And I think one of the main things that triggers upset emotions is when we try to put energy and focus into changing what we have no control over. That's a recipe for feeling overwhelmed, for feeling frustrated, and for feeling actually more powerless. Clarify your goal. What's most important? So another client I was seeing recently, one of the situations she was dealing with was an ex-son-in-law. And he was the father of her 3 grandchildren. So she didn't like him. He was not usually very nice to her. And she really wanted to tell him what she thought of him. And in looking about it, thinking it through, looking at this model of circles of control and power, what she realized was that by being critical with him, she pushed him away, and she created actually more disharmony for her 3 grandchildren. So when she got really clear, what's really important to her was as much as peace and harmony for her grandchildren, and she focused her attention and her behavior and her thoughts and her energy on what she could do to help create peace and harmony for them. So one thing she did was, whenever she was with her grandchildren, she always thanked their father, her ex-son-in-law, for being willing to let her have them. Afterwards, she would always give him, again, appreciation, keep him up to date on what was happening, communicate. She found it very hard to be with him face to face, but what she did discover is that it was really the easiest way to communicate with him was through text. So if she was running late to pick up her grandchildren from his home, she would always text, "I'm on my way. I should be there in about 10 minutes." So there was not any surprise. She'd get there, she'd text again, "I'm out front," so the kids would be ready. She'd wait a few minutes before going in to pick them up, so that she didn't have to be in his home longer than she could tolerate easily. So she began to look at what she could do in that situation, and again, really keeping in mind her goal, which was to do whatever she could to create a peaceful, harmonious environment for her grandchildren. And also, as I was giving that example, to plan your actions, to focus on what you can control, what you have power over, and look at where could she influence. So by being always gracious to her ex-son-in-law, by always giving him a heads up on her time frame, by always thanking him afterwards for allowing her to have time with them, what happened was she was hopefully, and actually as it turned out she actually was beginning to have a little bit of influence on him. And she told me recently that for the first time in over a decade that he had actually said thank you to her. So progress. I thought that was really, really interesting, and she recognized that was really a big change. So those are my thoughts about how to handle a difficult situation, a difficult person. Again, just to review, keep in mind the 3 circles of control. The middle part, area where you have control and power. The middle circle, areas where you can have influence. And mostly we have influence by how we treat people. So being always gracious, regardless of what they're doing, regardless of how they're treating us, not being a doormat, but being gracious, can actually increase the amount of influence that we have. And the more influence we have, actually, the more power we have in this situation. So a different way to think about dealing with stress and dealing with difficult people in our lives. I hope this was helpful. If you'd like to subscribe to my YouTube channel, just go to my name, Anne, A-N-N-E, Goshen, G-O-S-H-E-N, and you'll find some more videos there. Then I hope that this was helpful to you today. And you might also check out my website.